They don't hate wolves. They just hate the idea of losing their livelihood. And that's something that's really important. So for me, if we can prevent the conflict and we can empower rural areas and rural, landowners and ranchers to be the best stewards of that land that we can, that's the best way to keep conservation alive in the West.
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World. I'm Ben Goldsmith, and I'm here with Daniel Curry, who's in the countryside in northeastern Washington state near the Canadian and Idaho borders. And Daniel is a range rider and kind of the closest thing to a cowboy that I have in my circle of friends, who is devoting his life to fostering coexistence between ranchers, cowboys, and large carnivores, especially wolves. Daniel, thank you so much for taking the time to chat to me today. I'm really grateful.
Oh, thank you, Ben, for the opportunity. I really appreciate this.
Daniel, how did you personally come to working on coexistence with carnivores? I mean, you must be a kind of, in a way, a kind of hate figure, because we read over here in the press this sort of toxic atmosphere around wolves in the American West. Those that love them on one side, and the caricature, of course, is that they're in the cities, and those that hate them among the kind of lonesome dove, romantic kind of cowboy ranching communities. So how did you come to be in the center of this whole conversation?
I think kind of you just hit it on the head, to be honest, Ben. I think for me, there was a definite issue, and somebody needed to step up to help bring solutions to the table. And I saw basically two different factions throwing rocks at each other, and the only thing that was suffering and getting hurt was the culture that these people love and the animals that these other people love. And I just decided that something needs to happen and we need to build a bridge between that. And so I basically came up into an area that was, in the beginning, definitely fraught with hate about something that I really admire and care for, which is wolves and other large predators and just the natural world in general. So I think for me, it was something needs to be done, and I think we can do this in a lot better way. There's a win-win-win situation when there's, when everybody's losing, there's potential to help everybody in that way. So I came up here and tried to directly inject love into a subject that is full of hate and misunderstanding. And instead of approaching that, from a side that I'm trying to win a fight, like so many advocates that I see, I don't want to win a fight. I just want to stop the war.
Daniel, where did you grow up? Where does this love of nature come from?
Yeah, I think my love of nature definitely was an innate thing. It was part of me from the beginning, but my mom definitely helped cultivate that, I think. Growing up on the west side, though, we grew up in a lot of areas that were unsavory, we'll say. Grew up with a single mom, she was doing the best she could. And a lot of the areas were void of natural, animals, natural places to where I can go run and play in the dirt as a little kid. So anytime that I could, as the moment that I could drive or the moment I could find a friend that could take me out to the woods, like I would encourage them to go hiking and go out there. So on the west side of Washington is where I mainly grew up, but we moved a lot. I mean, we moved every year, except for a couple times we moved every 2 years, but the majority of the time it was just constantly moving around on the western side of Washington state. And then what brought me east was wolves as they expanded west from, through introduction efforts in Yellowstone. I went east, they came west, we met in northeast Washington and started to work together and find a way to make this work for everybody.
So what were your first kind of professional forays? What were you doing in your early, mid-20s, late 20s?
Oh man, since I was 20, I was working with wolves. I've been working with wolves for, over 23 years now. So I started working with wolves at a world-renowned captive wolf sanctuary. So we were working with the SSP program, Species Survival Plan, which is now called SAFE, Save Animals from Extinction. We were participating with Mexican gray wolves and red wolves, and then we were also a sanctuary for displaced gray wolves. And that's where I learned about wolf behavior. That's where I learned about the plight of these animals. I learned about how there's a lot of like head-on, or nargy-bargy, as you guys would say, there's a lot of head-on conflict between large carnivores and rural America. And then on top of that, there's a disconnect between rural America and urban America. And that's what a lot of this problem is. This is not a wolf and cattle problem. This is a human problem. So learning that on the ground in a sanctuary and then applying that to the wild landscapes that I live and work in now was quite a feat, but really rewarding.
Yeah, I think the paradox of this discussion is that the people that you come across who are most connected with landscape and with nature are often the people who are also doing things that we as rewilders, nature lovers, most hate. So kind of those amazing people you come across in kind of the mountains of northern Spain, which is a place I know a little bit. They're the ones who really know every valley. They know where the trout are if they want to go fishing. The ones who spend all their time outside, who have this kind of sacred connection with the land, are often also the ones who are going to try and poison a wolf pack. And they might even be the one who are going to cut the heads off those wolves and nail it to the national park tourist billboard or what have you. And the same is true all over the place, whether it comes to kind of harmful fishing practices or industrial scale ranching of sheep in the uplands of Great Britain, which has been ecologically disastrous. Now, these are amazing people. I was just recently on a podcast with some Welsh interviewers talking about nature recovery in Wales. Now, the last native Welsh speakers are sheep farmers in the valleys of Wales. Now, these people are the backbone and the soul of these remote communities. And they're amazing because they really know, they've been there for generations, they know the land, but they also run these incredibly intensive sheep ranching operations that have rendered the land more or less lifeless. So how do you deal with that paradox? It seems so within reach that these people can be the greatest friends of the nature rewilding, nature loving community that we have. It's like within touching distance and yet also so far.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point that you're hitting on, Ben. And that's something that I learned years ago, actually. A little side story. I was at this wolf advisory group meeting, testified on behalf of balance in regards to ranchers and wolves. It's not a choice between one or the other. Went to open the door. After that, I went to the grocery store, went to open the door for somebody, and they looked at me like I was insulting them. And they were like, you don't need to open the door for me. And there was a very big disconnect there. And I learned immediately, I was like, okay, so the people that live in cities really have this idea of, this rewilding, this natural place that I don't get to see every day. And they love that. And they love that idea. And the people that actually live, like you said, right on the land with these animals on a daily basis, there's a much different mentality. Like the difference there is when I first moved over here, my Jeep, actually, I didn't know how to drive in snow that well. And we get really big snow loads over here. Jeep went off into a snowbank and the first car that went by said, "Hey, do you need help?" They pulled over. They're like, "Hey, we're neighbors. Where do you live?" I told them. They pulled me out. They're like, "Do you have any family up here?" I was like, "Nope." "Do you have a wife? Do you have kids?" "Nope." "Do you have friends?" I was like, "Oh, my animals." And they're like, "What are you doing?" I was like, "I moved up here to try and help basically reconnect people to the natural world and really help these cultures, these rural cultures thrive." And they said, "Well, come on down and have dinner," and that was a completely different reaction from when I tried to open the door for this gentleman that was, walking inside this grocery store. And I realized at that point, when you're living with wolves, for instance, like I love wolves. In my heart of hearts, I love wolves. And I also love these rural communities. And when you're living with those animals and you've been generationally ingrained that these animals need to be deleted from the landscape and that we need to utilize this landscape heavily and it's all about resource extraction, that's something that's ingrained into these rural communities. That's how they survive. Logging is a huge industry out here. Ranching, like you said. And there is a bit of a disconnect from the natural world that they live in because there's a potential threat there. So I think a lot of these reactions to go kill a wolf, to go poison them, I think that's a fear-based reaction. I learned that in the beginning. I was like, okay, so you're scared of losing your culture. That's primarily what you're worried about, is that this way of living will go away and it might be brought to your door by wolves, or it might be brought to your door by cougars or grizzlies or whatever the next megafauna is that we bring to these rural areas. So I think for me, it was a real clear indicator that there's nobody that's here to help them, for instance, deal with these animals in the landscape that their grandfathers really diligently tried to, eradicate from the landscape. And now they're back and you can't pick up a phone when wolves are most active. I mean, that was one of the first things when I came here. They're like, it's nice just to even have somebody to call. And when I realized that they just needed somebody to listen, they just needed a service to prevent the conflict, they don't hate wolves. They just hate the idea of losing their livelihood. And that's something that's really important. So for me, if we can prevent the conflict and we can empower rural areas and rural, landowners and ranchers to be the best stewards of that land that we can, that's the best way to keep conservation alive in the West, in my opinion. So that's like when we first met, Ben, I was like, I love rewilding, but that's half of it. We actually have to cultivate an importance for these animals in the landscape for the people that live with them on a daily basis so that they can view them in a positive way instead of a negative way. And when you remove that, it's amazing to see what happens. I mean, I've got ranchers now that when I first met them and they're pulling their hair like there's just too many wolves, this isn't going to work. I've got them videotaping them interacting with their cows, like Blair Witchy kind of, because they're excited and they know that that's not a dangerous behavior that they're seeing. That's not a dangerous behavior that the wolf is exhibiting. And they're like, this is amazing. And they see the beauty of that animal. So now we've taken conflict away and we've empowered that person that has, thousands of private acres to open that up to the wild.
Do you think part of the problem is that most, if not all, of the factors that pose a genuine threat to the livelihoods of these remote, rural, often pretty conservative communities are genuinely beyond their control, and that being able to kill wildlife such as wolves is the one thing that they can control? So whilst the wolves themselves really don't pose a threat to their livelihoods, and we're going to talk about that, I hope, in the kind of practical considerations of a resurgent wolf population in places like rural East Washington, it is the one thing that they can do something about. Whereas they can't do anything about global trade policy or tariffs or food prices or kind of mass immigration or shortage of labor or whatever it might be that genuinely is changing things for their livelihood.
Yeah. I think for me, from what I've seen on the ground for, doing this non-lethal, working with wild carnivores and doing non-lethal conflict mitigation with the communities out here, what I'm seeing, that's the only tool in their toolbox that they know of. So they just go to that. When you're a hammer, all you see is a nail. When all you can see is, that's my rifle, that's the only solution. So I think that for me, they have other options. They're just not on the landscape a lot of the times. Like when I first moved here, for instance, like I said, the gentleman was like, it's great to be able to call somebody at 5 o'clock because, the Fish and Game, they open at 9. Guys leave the office at 10, they get back at 4, and then they're gone for the day at 5. So for me, I think that's all that they know currently. That's the only thing that they've had in their toolbox for generations. That's what, again, their grandfather's grandfather told them to do. And now that we know that there's better ways and we're at a point of human evolution that we realize biodiversity is the key to this planet ticking. It's like this is what keeps us alive as well. I think that for like Project Griff, that's the nonprofit that I founded, our focus is to really enrich those toolboxes, offer a lot of different tools. So it's not just always a nail that they're seeing because they only have a hammer in there. So, and what I've noticed is when that is offered, a dramatic change happens. An extremely dramatic change can happen for these folks. They're calling me. I had a call. I was going over there to help some wolves, and he calls me and he's like, I have a swather in this barn and there's cougars in there and I'm scared. And my neighbor is going to go in there and kill them, but that's the only option that we have. And I said, you know what, I'll show up a little earlier and I'll see what I can do. And I went in there and crawled in the barn with the cougars and scared them out. And now those cougars' descendants, that lineage is still part of that ranch. He just gave me a video a month ago of them walking up the road, and they're now an integrated part of that ranch. So instead of saying, hey, we don't need to shoot them, I can crawl in that barn and poke that cougar in the rear with the ski pole, because that's the only non-lethal tool I had at the time. Shoestring budget, my friend, but you do what you got to do. And I think the main thing there, Ben, is if we can offer something better, I think it's the human nature to take that option if there's results that you cannot deny.
This episode of Rewilding the World is very kindly brought to you by Uni, that's UNI, the world's first nature-friendly line of luxury body care. We've all heard about the harm that sun cream does to coral reefs, but it's not just sun cream and it's not just coral reefs. Well, Uni makes plastic-free, nature-friendly essentials like shampoo, conditioner, hand wash, and even natural deodorant, all full of nourishing ingredients such as seaweed kelp, aloe vera, and olive oil. We've been loving our Uni products, but don't take it from me. Here's my wife, Jemima.
Yes, I really love them. They're such clean and nourishing products. The microalgae body oil is so good and really smells amazing.
You can find Uni products at Space NK or at weareuni.com. How real are the practical problems that ranchers in these remote places are facing on account of wolves in particular, but also cougars? I mean, the famous podcaster Joe Rogan put out a bunch of posts saying, oh, I love wolves. We just can't have them in places where there are ranches. And I wonder, is that true? Because I looked up the number of livestock killed in, say, Montana last year by wolves. And it's nothing. It's like, I think the figure was 40 or 60 individual livestock animals in a state that has 2.5 million livestock animals. So we're talking like a negligible, non-existent percentage of livestock actually killed by wolves. And of course, they're not killing people. So are there genuine practical issues here, or are we purely dealing with a psychological and cultural issue?
Definitely there's some practical issues there. I mean, so for instance, there's a 2% loss ratio that when people put animals out in the landscape in June and got them back in October, generally you lose 2% of the amount that you put out there. And that would be attributed to mechanical injuries. They got pneumonia, they fell off a cliff. We've had people shoot cows out here, and that doesn't help anything. When wolves became another variable in the landscape again after, since they were eradicated and extricated from their, 95% of their home range in the 30s, that's a long, big window of time that these folks didn't have to deal with that animal, that variable in the landscape. So when they came back, that 2% loss ratio became unacceptable. And it became like, hey, that's wolves that are taking that now. So a couple multi-pronged answer to your question is, perception is 100% of reality. And if you perceive that you have a problem, you have a problem. And when you go into these situations, that's what I realized at first. It's like, I know that they're not going to eat all your cattle. But for the smaller rancher too, losing one or two cattle to wolves is very dramatically impactful to them. That's something that, you do that a couple of years in a row and that ranch could be gone. Now these larger ranchers that are using feedlots and they're ranching in all these areas, they won't be affected by that. But so when you look at the big picture, 1 to 2% of all these animals, if that comes from a little ma and pa ranch, that can destroy that ma and pa ranch. And that ma and pa ranch has, again, that private land holding, which comprises a lot of wild spaces. And so that's another goal of Project Griff, is to help connect these ranches to create corridors of cooperation is what we're calling them. So animals can move through. We have range riders there. We're eliminating conflict and allowing people to see these animals in a different light. But so yes, there is a true issue there a little bit. It's definitely blown out of proportion and kind of media, sensationalized in many ways. And you'll have some folks that are out here I've seen, and none of the ranchers that I actually work with and I'm honored to be, working with on a constant basis are at these meetings, but I've gone to a lot of public meetings and yeah, the only good wolf's a dead wolf. And like you mentioned, that's an inaccurate statement. And that's unfortunate that Joe Rogan said that. It's like, you can't have wolves on ranches on the same landscape. That's just a fact. This is not a wolf and cattle problem. This is a people problem.
Of course, the practical issues with wolves and cougars and other big carnivores get much worse when you start killing them. Now, my understanding is that you get territorial structures in place when there's an established population. And within those territorial and family structures, there is a certain level of behavior in which humans and their livestock are avoided. And when you shatter those territories and break up those families by shooting, say, the alpha wolf or a dominant territorial female cougar, the young adolescent animals start to run rampage, and then they will go for the easiest food around, which is livestock. So is there any understanding of this among ranching communities, that on a pure practical level, killing these animals makes the situation worse?
There is, for the folks that we've helped put different tools in the toolbox. The ones that still only have the hammer continue to look at that as, we just have to kill them. So, for instance, that's a really good point though, Ben. I have a ranch that I work with. It's a second guy that I've ever ridden for. We had 11 animals, 200 feet from his calving pasture, no problem. 11 wolves, I should say. They were just trafficking back and forth. They were, utilizing the landscape behind them. And what we do is we kind of try and toggle and move, his cattle around, allow areas where wolves can go, allow areas where cattle can go, and make sure that they generally don't overlap. And we had high success. It was just me, my team out there. No cattle were attacked. No cattle were, chased or stressed. And what happened is that pack of 11 animals, a pack of 11 wolves, went over to a different ranch. Because what they do is they'll run a circuit. And they're looking for a loophole, the path of least resistance. Like all of us were comprised of water. So are these animals. They're looking for, what is the easiest way that I can make a living today? Because it's really, really risky to go hunt to get a drink of water, especially for wolves, just to be exposed like that. So they found a loophole at a different ranch a few miles away, took advantage of, there was dead cattle on the ground. It's not a big leap from, when they're starting to scavenge and they look over and they're like, hey, there's unattended cattle over here. Let's make that leap. And they did. And unfortunately, our state agency went in there and lethally removed some. There were some that were lethally removed from range riders, which is another issue that I've got. So what that did is they basically eradicated those animals. There was about 3 or 4 left based on observations from, remote cameras on ground sites and visuals of the animals, and then just what we're seeing on tracks and scat and sign. And there was another pack that they also, the state agency went lethal on. And there's some range riders over there removing those wolves. I don't call them range riders, people that are labeled that. But what that did is these two packs were just totally destroyed, basically. The pack dynamics were fragmented and shattered, like you said. So they actually came together, these two separate packs, formed kind of like a odd little aggregate pack, and they came back to the ranch that they were safe at. And they were right in there with the cows playing. They didn't know any better. They were, this is the young of the year. They're like, we don't have our parents. We're just kind of linking up with this other pack. And there was one sub-adult that was leading the group of four. And it was heartbreaking to know that all they had to do was go to a neighbor that wasn't participating, and it just shattered that whole pack structure. It killed that family, and it really just created a problem that if they went to a different ranch and they were playing in that field, they would have been eradicated there as well. But so yeah, there's issues with that.
How do you fund the work you're doing? Are you a paid consultant to these ranchers, or do you raise money philanthropically from trusts, foundations, individuals, and then just get out there with your team and just start working with neighboring ranchers?
Yeah, so I mean, there's been a lot of times, Ben, where there's just been no funding, so it's just been like, you got to do what you got to do, Daniel. And there's been a lot of times where, mortgage payments, I've put my house on the line, I've put everything on the line just to make sure there's diesel in the tank and food in the belly of the horses that I'm asking to go out there. Because if you don't show up and they have another person to call, what will happen is if that ranch is left to their own devices and they don't feel like they're getting any assistance or help, they'll probably revert back to the only toolbox that they had before meeting us in Project Riff, and that's lethal control. So funding is always the biggest crux. I've got a lot of creative ideas in the works to create a self-sustaining funding platform to get people out and help build that bridge between rural America and urban America. And I mean, this could be applied anywhere. It doesn't have to be America. But yeah, so funding's always an issue. But yeah, it's private. Basically, philanthropists that will believe in my work. They're like, hey, we want to see more of these success stories. And that's what I'm trying to do, is basically scale this up. I've spoken to people from France, spoken to people from Finland. I've spoken to every Western state in the U.S. about the same problem, and they're all voicing the same concerns. So we're seeing that this is a huge need that needs to be filled, and we're trying to do the best we can to establish a chapter of the nonprofit there.
Here in Britain, the return of beavers has been kind of controversial. It's been a huge success story. I mean, 15 years ago, you'd stop a random person in the street, rural or urban, and they didn't even know that there'd once been a native species of beavers here in Europe and Britain. And now you stop almost anyone anywhere, and not only do they know that they're native and that they're back, but that they play a vital role in kind of holding the ecosystem together. They're breathing new life back into landscapes and helping to protect us from flooding and drought. So the return of beavers has been a miracle, but not without its practical difficulties for landowners, especially farmers in lower lying kind of flat arable landscapes where they can damage crops and so on. And so where beavers have returned, the government as well as local NGOs have invested in a certain amount of beaver kind of advice. You get a kind of beaver management consultant, a kind of beaver warden, who's mostly funded with charitable funds, who then goes up and down the river talking to neighbors and landowners and so on, talking to them about the return of beavers and helping to troubleshoot where problems arise. Isn't that something that the states which have recovering wolves populations should be doing themselves? Like, why is it down to you and a bunch of range riders relying on the generosity of strangers to do this work? Why are the states of Washington and Oregon and Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, why are they not looking to try to foster some kind of coexistence here and help ranchers deal with the problem in a constructive way?
Yeah, politics and then capacity. I've talked to a lot of different state agencies, and they just don't have the capacity to put people out there in the landscape. I was speaking to an excellent man in Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. He's really working hard, and he's like, if I'm putting flattery up on the west side of the state and I get a call that there's a depredation on the east side and it's just me, like I can't do anything with that. And that's leaving a lot of loopholes open to these wild animals that are like, that's all we need, This 9 to 5 business, when you're forced to do that schedule, they just wait till 5 p.m. I mean, that's when they're active anyways. They're crepuscular animals. They're like, we're not active during the times that your personnel are out here. So a lot of it's that. I've had that question asked a lot from potential funders, actually, because they're like, why aren't we doing this? The other thing is our current administration did a lot of cutting of federal and state support. So like this year, I had the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife reach back out. I was their first contracted range rider in the state. And I had them reach out this year and say, hey, we need help. Something needs to change. And I was like, I absolutely agree. And they asked me to wrote some proposals. And then that budget cut happened and they were dead in the water. So it does leave that up to small entities, a third party. I don't even mean small, I just mean like a third party service. And then on top of that, I think, Ben, is there's a lot of trust issues with having government personnel on your property. If you think about it from like rural America, a lot of these people move out to rural America to live their life, to be unfettered, to not have anything, imposing on them. And then to have people come out in your landscape that you don't really trust, that are knowingly lying to you. And then, we've had state agency personnel trespass on private land. And that takes a lot of trust that you really earn, and it just guts it. So it's like, but yeah, that's a big reason of it. I think, like in the beginning when I was asked, do you want to be, a staffer on this Department of Fish and Wildlife? And it took me about 10 seconds to answer that in my head. And I was like, let me sleep on it. But if I go up there with that badge on me and I knock on their door, I'm no longer a neighbor. I'm now just an agency member. I like to come up to them and say I'm a neighbor, and that's where I've made most of my traction.
So give me reasons for optimism, Daniel. Like the work that you're doing is just awesome and needs to be expanded across a bunch of Western states. But it's fair to say that the political winds don't support recovery of large carnivores in most places. Colorado may be the exception. And that most ranchers want these animals dead, as far as I can make out. So are these animals recovering anyway? Because the argument in Europe, where wolves and European brown bears have made a dramatic recovery, as well as lynx and a whole bunch of other species, is that even if the political winds are changing against them, there just aren't enough angry old men with guns and poisons out there to make any real dent on the population. It's kind of done. Like European wolf recovery, 27,000 wolves, large wild areas in which there isn't much farming activity anymore. They're not going anywhere. And could that be said for the lower 48? Could it be that this recovery is inexorable, and that those ranchers and politicians who really want to reverse it don't necessarily have the power to do so anyway?
I hear your question. A couple things there, I guess. Somebody asked me a long time ago, what does wolf recovery to you? And it's not a numeric metric that we have to meet that then, yay, we're recovered. For me, it's when we cultivate, again, an appreciation for these animals and the landscape that they actually live in on a day-to-day basis with these folks. So to rely on like the procreation rate and how wolves will spread really forgets about the individual, for one. And I think that we're in a time and frame and where, we're learning that these animals are sentient beings. We're learning that, biodiversity is needed. We're learning that the individual in a pack of wolves may be crucial if that animal is removed, and it might actually push that pack of wolves to a behavior that you were really not wanting to go to in the first place. That's why you went in there and lethally removed them. So the individual is important. That's one thing. I don't think that relying on, just, hey, they're going to recover anyways. There's a lot of poaching that goes on, identified, unidentified. So to say that there's not enough old men out there, I think there might be, unfortunately. I've been out there a lot and found poison baits and, bait piles and traps. And it's something that isn't productive. It doesn't help. It actually will probably produce the results that those people that are putting that bait pile out there in the first place don't want. I think for me, it's a mentality shift that we actually have to do, like a paradigm shift that we're looking for. And that's something that is critical to the recovery process for any large carnivore or any animal in the world, in my opinion. Beaver, I've done some beaver work, actually. It's very exciting work. I love beavers. We've done it up here, and the same mentality, I don't want them here. They're going to flood my area. And it's like, well, have you ever thought of how that's going to enrich the soil? And that's kind of a different way of regenerative ag. And we can maybe figure out ways that we can balance people's interests and the natural behavior of these animals in a way that everybody benefits from it. So I think we need to really strive to prevent conflict and not just rely on, these animals will recover anyways. Because we've been doing that for a while in Washington, for instance, and we had our worst year last year. The population went down 9%. There was a lot of poachings that went on, and a lot of money went into non-lethal, and then it went into lethal. So it's like, well, there's a better way to do this, I think. So yes, they will. Wolves will recover to an extent, but we have to really help guide this process in a way that it lands in a place that's positive for everyone. Because if we don't, I think there is a lot of people out there that are doing some damage, and instead of attacking them, we just have to open their hearts and minds and have them view these animals in a different way. And some people won't, and that's okay too.
Daniel, I know you're focused on the West, and this is where the crux of the argument about wolves and large carnivores happens. But what about the recovery of wolves in states that potentially have a less hard attitude towards them? Wolves are back in California. Cougars are certainly moving east with a certain amount of speed. You've got both wolves and cougars potentially going to recolonize the eastern states from the north, from Quebec, from Ontario. How's that going to play out? Because you don't have quite the same dynamics. You don't have the same kind of ranching industry. You don't have, it's not so recent, the kind of hardcore kind of frontier mentality kind of battle against the elements in those places. So do you think the wolf and the cougar and so on can have these whole new strongholds in North America that weren't available a few years ago?
I definitely think so. And I think there's definitely a higher chance of success where there is less potential for conflict. I think that you'd be surprised where you might find conflict crop up if there's nothing there to help, prevent that in the first place. For instance, like California, there's a lot of open space there, but they've already declared a state of emergency, the ranchers out there, based on the wolves that are coming in. So again, I think we go back to, this is a fear-based reaction of we don't want to lose our life. We don't want to lose our livelihood and our culture. So if we address that at its root, and we just have somebody that's out there helping guide this, I think they can recover anywhere. But yeah, you'll have definitely more success if you don't have conflict. But man, it's amazing that people, like, for instance, I've been to a lot of public hearings, and the majority of the people in there don't have any cows. They don't have any livestock, and they're in there voicing their concerns. They're in there voicing their hate about these animals, and that's something that I think that's just kind of jumping on the bandwagon. This is the norm. I'm joining I'm following the masses, and that's something that's creating conflict in its own right. And that's somebody that doesn't have any livestock on the ground. That's somebody that doesn't have any skin in the game, so to speak.
So what's life like for a rancher in where you are in Washington State who is pro-wolves? Do they get bullied by their neighbors at all?
Yeah, I mean, they can. I mean, when I first started, for instance, it was like you had to really be conscientious of where you're getting your funding from, for one. So when you go in there and you're saying, hey, I want to help you, they're like, are you just another person that's coming here with some nefarious intentions, and I don't want you on my land? So for the folks that actually opened the door to me and said, hey, let's work something out. I need help, and you're the only one that's stepping up to help. They have been really quietly successful, and I think it's until now. I've had a couple of featured documentaries on my work because of just I think the way the world is viewing this subject. And those ranchers went above and beyond and stuck their neck out. And I asked them why, and they're like, because you've stuck your neck out for us and helped us, and we know that what you're doing works. We believe in what you're doing, and we want more help. And I think it's a good way to ostracize yourself potentially from your community. But with that being said, these folks, again, weren't in those buildings in the first place during these, public comments that were so aggressive, so on the brink of violence, So I think the folks that I'm honored to work with, if they just keep quiet in the first few years, they're like, yeah, we're just going to have a quiet, successful story with Daniel. And then as they continue that, I mean, in the beginning, for instance, I was ready. I hit the ground. I was like, all right, let's do this non-lethal conflict mitigation. And it was like crickets. It was like, oh, I could supply everybody because there was no demand. And now it's flipped on its axis. Now there's more demand than I can supply because of word of mouth from neighbors, because saying, hey, why aren't you experiencing any problems with these animals? Oh, well, I've got this guy that comes out here with the team, and they come out here and help, and we're not experiencing conflict. So I think if we can, again, support these ranches and help the ranch resilience, increase in their own, and help teach and learn at the same time with these ranches on what needs to be done, we can have success, and we can normalize that success instead of normalizing the hatred for, on either end of the spectrum.
Danu, you are doing heroic work, you and your fellow range riders out there in eastern Washington State. I wish there was a team like your Project Griff in all of the western states, in every district. It strikes me that this is totemic in the struggle to find true harmony with nature. Our long-term survival depends upon us coexisting harmoniously with nature, falling back in love with nature and all aspects of nature. And the hardest thing is to fall back in love with large carnivores and to find a way to rub along with them. And you are working on that in one of the hardest places to do that anywhere in the world. So I'm filled with admiration for you. I hope I can be of help to you in one way or another. I hope we can stay well in touch and that I can visit you out in the Wild West sometime. But in the meantime, thank you so much for taking the time to have this call with me. I really appreciate it.
No, absolutely, Ben. I really appreciate it. And I guess on one more note, I think conflict is a choice, and that's a thing to be optimistic about, because if it's a choice, we have the option to move beyond that and to choose a better way for everybody. So thank you so much, Ben, for the time. I'm just honored that you had me on your podcast. Anytime you're up here, please give me a call. You have a place here, man. So, and I'll put you on a horse or a mule that's right behind this camera right here, and we'll go out riding, and you can meet some amazing people that are doing some amazing work with us. So thank you again, Ben. I appreciate you.
I love that Daniel Curry calls himself a range rider. He's also performing some of the most important work in the West around this incredibly thorny issue of coexistence with wolves and other wildlife. He's a real hero, and I'd love to get out to visit him sometime. If you enjoyed this episode with Daniel Curry, please do give us a like or a share. Spread the word among your friends. It makes a huge difference. Next time, I'm going to be talking to Sandy Luck, Chief Executive of the Marine Conservation Society, which is one of the UK's premier conservation organisations. Sandy and her team are cooking up a huge plan to restore Britain's wild Atlantic coast from Cornwall all the way up to the northwest of Scotland. I hope you'll join us for that conversation.
Hi everyone, this is Selena Chen. You may have heard me recently on the podcast with Ben talking about rewilding the Indian Ocean with giant Aldabra tortoises. You may have also heard that I've been fighting a giant development on Assumption Island along with an amazing coalition of organizations and activists. We're called Friends of Aldabra, and this development was set to bring catastrophic destruction to Aldabra Atoll, one of the most pristine biodiversity hotspots in the world. And after over a year of campaigning, of organizing, of bringing together leaders in science, conservation, media, storytelling, guess what? There's a new president in Seychelles. There's a new government in Seychelles. And this new president has announced on BBC that he is set to halt this development and stop the construction and stop this ridiculous hotel that could bring an enormous catastrophe to a pristine biodiversity hotspot. This is a huge win, but we at Friends of Aldabra are holding him accountable to his word. So the fight is not yet over. However, I wanted to come on here and thank you guys so much for your support, for taking action, and also, stay tuned for more, because Friends of Aldabra is still continuing the fight. We want long-term protection of Aldabra, and we want to make sure that no future destructive developments can happen on Assumption. And we're going to need your support in doing that. So stay tuned. Thank you so much, and see you soon.
Check out the podcast with Selena to hear my full conversation about giant tortoises and the fight to save the Aldabra Islands.